Well, good evening and welcome to this evening's event here at Jesus College from the Intellectual Forum. My name is Julian Huppard. I'm the director of the Intellectual Forum here, and it's great to have you all here in this place, whether you are in this lovely Frankopan Hall or you're watching us online. Jesus has an amazing history. Some of you I know this very well. We were originally set up in 1144 as a nunnery. And then in 1496, we became a college of the University of Cambridge. We've talked about lots and lots of things during that time, during those 880 years. I have to say, democracy was probably not one of the top priorities back in the day. I don't know what the nuns thought about democracy. I don't know what the Bishop of Ely, who kicked the women out and turned it to an all-male college, thought of democracy. We fixed that. But more recently, it has become an ever-growing challenge. We've run lots of conversations about lots of different topics here at the Intellectual Forum since we were set up in 2016. Many of these are available historically. We've looked at a whole set of challenges around finance, around geopolitics, alongside lots of other rather more fun activities. Just on Tuesday, we had an event looking at anti-Kremlin protest art, for example. Which was an absolutely fascinating and challenging event. But tonight we're going to be looking at whether democracy is for sale in the US and in this country. And this is a topic which has become more and more of a challenge. We have a wonderful panel. Now, I was going to introduce our three panelists. There's a slight issue. One of them, Peter Gagan, who wrote the book Democracy for Sale, has COVID. And so unfortunately, he's not here. Parth Patel from IPPR, who's agreed to speak in his place, is, I believe, on his way. Have you heard anything more about that? But will be joining us shortly in order to speak as our last panelist. But before that, we're going to hear from a US representative and then a UK representative. So we'll first hear from Jeff Clements. Jeff has an amazing track record in many, many ways. I'm not going to try to cover all of his amazing career. We were talking earlier, he's been Assistant Attorney General in Massachusetts. He set up American Promise. And I've also discovered he has a habit of picking up and chatting to women on the plane. So on the flight over here, he was chatting to somebody called Theresa May, if you remember her. Sorry to spoil your story, but so who knows who
I wasn't going to tell it.
Who knows who we will talk to on the way back, or indeed what she paid or he paid to have the things happen. So we'll hear from Jeff about what's happening in the US, which I think has got much, much worse. And there's, the story every day since we set up this event feels like it's worse. We won't hear from Peter, but we will hear from Dr. Sue Hawley, who runs Spotlight on Corruption. So she's done a huge amount about what's happening here in the UK about corruption. Now, I should say money in politics is not necessarily identical to corruption, but there are some rather obvious and rather alarming overlaps. So without any more from me, Jeff, do you want to come and start us off with the US picture? And thank you so much for being here at Jesus. It's absolutely wonderful to welcome you here. So.
Thank you, Julian.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Julian, and thanks to everybody. I did, in fact, meet your former Prime Minister on the plane on the way over here. She was a lovely woman, and we actually began the conversation about comparative democracy in the United States and Britain. She's teaching at Yale University on democracy. And I am from Cambridge, Massachusetts, which we think of as an old, beloved college town, 1635, which I know is not old here. And Julian kindly said it was one of our more successful spin-offs. The subject tonight, Democracy for Sale, I'm sorry that Peter Gagan isn't here. His book is wonderful. I recommend it. But I have to say, from an American perspective, the numbers which you here in the UK find alarming are very quaint in terms of money spent to influence elections and the manner in which it's spent. So at American Promise, we launched our organization in 2016 with a single objective, which I'll talk about tonight, and that is to help Americans across the political spectrum, we don't care who they vote for, unite to amend the United States Constitution. It's a written one in our country, so you can actually amend it with words that then becomes part of the Constitution. And I'll talk about that. But I want to talk about why this issue is even a constitutional issue and an amendment-worthy issue, which might be puzzling, as it's puzzling to Americans, too. Why don't we just pass laws to deal with it? And so let me begin, though, with why we need an amendment by talking about some facts, okay? So one fact is in 2024, the United States federal elections alone were $15 billion. That's with a B. And the breakdown, now you might think, well, 15 billion, that's a lot of money. It's hard to even imagine, once you're talking billions, just what that looks like. But there's a couple of things to unpack about it. One is that we're a bigger country, obviously, continental-wide country, 300 million people. But that is multiple times what our federal elections cost nearly a decade ago. So that's one way to think about the rapid scale of how fast that money is growing. And then the other, though, is to look more closely at some of the elections that add up to that. So that's the presidency in 2024, but it's also Senate races for the United States Senate, and it's also representatives in the House of Representatives, so all over the country. So if you're thinking in terms of like impact where people actually live, let me give you just one example. The state of Maine has fewer than 1 million, maybe about 1 million voters. It's perched in the Northeast, actually closest to where we are now of any other state probably. It's perching into the North Atlantic a little bit. It's where Senator Susan Collins is elected and serves in the U.S. Senate. And in 2014, a year or two before we started American Promise, people in Maine were outraged that the election cost nearly $10 million in that state to send Susan Collins, who won that election, to the United States Senate. Maine is not a wealthy state. That is a lot of money. And most of the donors came from outside the state, the large donors spending that money. And so $10 million. Fast forward her re-election campaign 6 years later, 2020, and this is both candidates, both sides. The election cost $200 million in this state of about 1 million voters. And they are now talking in 2026, when she is running again, that the election will cost $600 million. And there's barely media markets, and that's where much of the money goes, to media. So I got a call from a person who's a conservative leader in Maine. It could have been a liberal leader, wouldn't matter, but a civic leader in Maine, who said during the $200 million election that we are under an avalanche here. Nobody can hear us, and we can't hear each other. And so the money hits at local levels in ways that make people feel disenfranchised, because in a lot of ways they are. The money is coming from outside the state, by and large, from people who actually don't know anything about the state and don't really care. The fight is about power in Washington, D.C. So it is a fight about who controls the Senate, and Susan Collins' seat is very important. So you are getting global money, national money, not much Maine money. So they're now talking about the North Carolina Senate in 2026 being the first $1 billion United States Senate race. We now have what we call super PACs in local school committee elections. We have dark money. You don't know where it's coming from. We call it dark money because there is no disclosure of the source of it, and it can run through several layers. We have foreign money coming in. In Texas, they think of that as money from Boston or New York, but we also have money from all over the world now that nobody can trace coming into our elections. So right now, there's a poll released this week which mirrored the polls that have come out over the last few years in the US, and that we find, if you just talk to Americans, that shows close to 80% of Americans now believe money in politics is a top threat to democracy in the United States. It's not a policy concern, it's not a irritation. They're talking about it as a direct and serious and top threat to the future of democratic self-government in the United States. And we have found that, and I want to pose a question to pivot then to the constitutional question. Because if Americans feel that way, which we do, if that is no different between Republicans, Democrats, and independents, which is true, most Americans say this is wrong, it's dangerous, and it disconnects their government from them, that they do not feel represented, and they say the government really serves these big donors. Because most of the money actually comes from less than 1% of the people. The super PAC money, where much of the money runs through now, 97% of it comes from 1% of the donors in the country. This is concentrated money. Most vividly, we saw that in the last election when Elon Musk himself spent $300 million through a super PAC in the election. There's billionaires on the other side as well. So Americans know this is a problem. They know it goes to the heart of the democracy, and it does not make a difference which party or who they vote for in how they feel about this. So the question is, why don't we do something about it? And I think that's where we have a different, and in many ways, just like the amount of money and the concentration of the money among a powerful few, we have a different problem, a more serious problem than you have here in the United Kingdom. And that's because in America, we are not allowed to do anything about it, literally. The United States Supreme Court has decided that spending money to influence elections is freedom of speech under our First Amendment, meaning that any law that is passed that tried to say, like a law that we actually have on the books and we used to enforce, would say PACs, or political action committees, you can contribute $5,000 to them, no more. Limits, right? Why are billionaires putting $300 million into PACs? How do they do that legally? Well, because the Supreme Court says they have a free speech right to do that. And therefore, laws that contradict that free speech right will be struck down. Scores of laws have been struck down in the United States. We don't have an incapacity to pass anti-corruption laws. We do it all the time. Corporations, unions, limits on individual spending. The people of Maine, after they had $100 million spent by global energy companies, many of them owned by foreign governments, 100% owned by foreign governments, spent $100 million in that state's elections. The people of Maine passed a law overwhelmingly prohibiting foreign government spending in elections. The courts have struck it down, saying that violates the First Amendment free speech rights. So that is the scale of the problem in the United States. There is no fix, and I think the American people are right when they say this will end democracy if we don't change this system, because it doesn't leave free speech for people who don't have that kind of money, and it is breaking and corrupting the system in a systemic way. So, but here I bring good news. I hope you'll find it's good news. Jill Lepore, historian at Harvard, recently has a book out. I recommend it if you're interested in the American Constitution and its amendment process. It's called We the People. And she says the most significant contribution to political theory from America has been the notion that the people themselves can actually write and amend when they want the Constitution of the country. And I think she's absolutely right about that. I think it's a corollary to even a bigger contribution of our political thought, which is popular sovereignty, that the sovereign is the people. Now, a lot of what even Americans take for granted we only do because of the constitutional amendment process. The entire Bill of Rights, the right of women to vote, election of senators, the end of slavery, all of those and more were constitutional amendments. 9 of those amendments, actually 8 of them, I'm counting the amendment I'm going to tell you about in a minute, reversed Supreme Court decisions that the American people found unacceptable. And this will be number 9 because the American people find the Supreme Court's decisions, including most famously Citizens United, to be unacceptable because it's breaking our political system and system of self-government. So we're amending the Constitution in America, and it's for real. And I'll just close with some sharing where we are. To amend the United States Constitution is really hard, as it should be. It's not something we do very often. We have 27 amendments. We propose the 28th. It's simple. All good ideas in America fit on a napkin, or they don't work unless they can fit on a napkin. And ours fits on a napkin, so you can find it at our website at americanpromise.net. And it essentially overturns 50 years of Supreme Court mischief about trying to micromanage campaign finance laws and says those decisions are for the people. It returns power to the people in our elected branches to have and enforce anti-corruption laws and limits on money in politics. It would end the super PACs. It would stop the foreign money. It would bring back to scale the cost of elections. We'd have a lot of work to do that, but the American people have an appetite to stop this corruption, and the populism that's driving both left and right now in the United States is very supportive of this kind of thing, this returning the power to the people rather than the judiciary to decide what we're allowed to do about money in politics and what we're not. So to do an amendment, you need a 2/3 vote in Congress. That's hard. You need a vote after that in our federal system of 50 states. You need 3/4 of those states to actually ratify the amendment, as we say. That's majority votes in 50 state legislatures. So we're executing a strategy at American Promise that is the same as every amendment that succeeded, which is you go to the states first. We'll need the vote in Congress, but we're working in the states and in Congress, getting the states on board. So we have 23 states now that have formally passed laws saying we support this amendment, we want Congress to vote on it, and we're ready to ratify it. And these states are conservative states, they're liberal, progressive states, and they're states that are in between. 23 of them. We have half the Congress supporting it already. We're going to get the rest of them with this state-based program. We're probably a few years away from passage and ratification, but this is very much for real and deeply supported by Americans. And I'm confident that it will be the next amendment to the United States Constitution and begin this turn around that I am also confident we'll see, which will be a renewal of American democracy, less chaos, less instability, less violent division. And I say that with some confidence because that's what history shows. You know, we don't do constitutional amendments in sort of incremental 2 or 3 at a time. I mean, over one now, over 200 years. We do them in big bunches when the wheels are coming off our system. And if you look at, the Bill of Rights was after the Revolution. After the Civil War, 3 more amendments. Between 1910 and 1920, a very also time like our time now of big technological change, immigration pressures, challenges of adjusting to that, violent division, political assassination, world war, pandemic, all of the things. We did 4 constitutional amendments in the United States in 10 years, and that helped bring the country out for a much better future. Same thing happened in the 1960s, which in our country was another very violent time, political assassination, deep division, cities on fire, war, a president driven from office in corruption, a vice president indicted for bribery. 4 constitutional amendments in 10 years to help stabilize and come out the other side. So I would argue Americans know how to do it. We know the stakes. We are doing it. So that's my good news. And I look forward to the conversation tonight. I'm deeply grateful to the forum and Sue Hawley and everybody, all of you, for being here for this conversation. But it is a very serious situation with I think nothing less than democratic freedom at stake, and so I'm very glad to be here. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Some really fascinating and terrifying stuff there. I hope the optimism is right. We've done some events here with US judges. I think Wisconsin race this year was $100 million to elect one judge. Yeah. And I was talking to a state Supreme Court justice who reckoned they had to raise 10 million. I said, well, how do you do that? And they said, well, you just explain to people you'll be very fair. That was an interesting pitch. As some of you may know, I used to be the Member of Parliament here in Cambridge, and so I'm used to UK fundraising scales. For my re-election, which almost succeeded, I managed to raise about £100,000, which was quite a lot by UK standards. You can do that without promising the world to people. If I'd had to raise $1 million or 10 million, I just cannot imagine how it would work here, which is great. So that means we don't have any problems here in the UK. Wonderful. Good. But as we're about to hear, we have different but quite resonant problems. So we're going to hear from Sue, who I already introduced, and it's great to have Parth here, who braved the train system to be with us. So thank you very much for that. But Sue, thank you so much for being here to describe what's happening here in the UK.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. It's really exciting to hear optimism out of the US. I think it's too often that it's like head in the hands moment of like, oh no, what's happening? As you said, Jeff, ours is a different scale. It's not $15 billion worth of spending in a general election, but the last election was the most expensive in UK history. So it was over 94 million. And that was thanks to the last government raising the spending limit by 80%. They said this was because of inflation, but our electoral commission said there is no good reason for doing this. The other thing that we saw at that last election, which we know thanks to the research from our colleagues at Transparency International UK, was that there was an increasing concentration of mega donors. So Transparency International UK found that 2/3 of the £85 million given in private donations came from just 19 mega donors. That was people giving over $1 million. So, we saw 10 million to the Conservative Party from one donor alone. These were really, really huge sums. And if Peter was here, and I'm really sorry that he's not, he would say, as he said on a panel to Parliament that I was on with him, that, he's been watching this for 10 years. Like 10 years ago, 50k was a huge sum in UK politics. So this is like a completely different kettle of fish. And so I think the thing is we are becoming a bit of a shadow of the US. And we know that a lot of the US stuff is going to come our way, frankly, whether it's third-party campaigning, digital campaigning, or a potential $100 million donation from one of your billionaires. So, and again, a little bit like you were saying, Jeff, actually there's quite a rare, well, it's hard to surface, but there is a bit of a cross-party consensus about this. When Peter and I were giving evidence in Parliament, there was a former Conservative Party treasurer, there was a Conservative peer, there was a Labour peer, and they all agreed vehemently that there's just too much money in politics. So, but we're in a bit of a prisoner's dilemma because no one wants to be the first mover and jeopardise their chances of raising enough money to fight the next election. But I wanted to, I was really inspired by looking at your stuff and the amendment and the principles behind it. And I thought I would elaborate kind of 3 principles for the UK, actually, about why we need to limit money in elections. And the first is about fairness. And it was really interesting, we don't have a written constitution, obviously, but we do have the European Court of Human Rights. And I did have one of those moments of like, what did the Romans ever do for us? and if you want to look at what did the ECHR ever do for us. Back in 1998, some of you may know, they gave quite a crucial judgment in the UK called Bauman versus UK, and it was the main judgment there is balancing freedom of expression and the right or freedom of us as citizens to have free elections. And at that stage, the spending limit for third-party campaigners was, does anyone know? £5. And they were told, the UK was told, that is a bit low actually in order to get freedom of expression. But, you know, your Article 10 right for freedom of expression has to be balanced against the Article 3 right to have free expression of the opinion of the people in the choice of their legislature. And the party spending limits played a key role in that free expression. That was actually just happened just after the last Labour government took power. And they defended it very, very carefully. And they defended it on 3 grounds. They said it promotes fairness between competing candidates to prevent wealthy third parties from campaigning for or against a particular candidate. The second was they wanted to ensure candidates remain independent of powerful interest groups. And the final one was about preventing the distortion of political debate at elections. These are all really important principles that if you get a chance to bend a current Labour politician's ear, it is worth reminding them that this was the last Labour government's principled defence of spending limits. And actually it's backed up by a lot of evidence from Canada, Brazil and the UK that, you know, the higher the spending limit, you get less candidates, you get less voter turnout, and you actually give an advantage to the incumbent candidate. So that's the first principle, fairness of elections. The second principle is actually public trust in democracy. Like you have in the US, it's really tanking here. We all know that. 63% of the UK think that the very rich have too much influence in politics. Back in 2016, the Committee on Standards in Public Life did surveys, and they found that 90% of the UK thought MPs would very often or sometimes decide to do what their donors want them to do. And just 18% of the UK surveyed feel that there is transparent party funding and spending. And there's no wonder, right? We've seen the access to capitalism scandals. You know, if you pay 250k, you get to be on a special advisory group. You can buy a tennis match with the Prime Minister in exchange for party funding. I don't think we're seeing quite the same under this government. But this was where we got down. We've the cash for honours gravy train of peerages for donors, you know, the academics, back in 2015 found that the odds of getting a peerage after giving a large donation was the same as winning the national lottery 5 times in a row. The final principle is really about preventing foreign interference. You know, next month we'll have, you know, the sentencing of the first British politician to face jail for taking bribes, for promoting a pro-Russian stance. We know that China and Russia have spent $300 million over a decade to try and influence democratic processes. You know, as I think Ed Lucas, who comments in the Times, said, why would you spend money and human lives on waging a war when you can try and influence their elections, which is what we've seen in Moldova. And it's no longer hostile states. I come back to the American influence that we like to feel. So what do we do about it? We have an elections bill coming up. Some of you will be aware, and it is like a once-in-a-decade opportunity to get this really right. And the new government has announced, you'll know it better as the kind of votes at 16 bill, but behind that are some really important changes to our political finance rules. Political parties finally will actually have to check where their money's coming from. Amazingly, their obligations are quite low in that regard at the moment. It's going to tighten up corporate donation, so you can't just set up a shell company, which is all too easy to do in the UK, and then donate as a foreigner. It's got new powers for the Electoral Commission. You know, currently they can fine a multi-million-pound donor £20,000 if a party, if they take a multi-million-pound donation. So they're going to raise that to 500k. But, you know, we really need ambition here. and there are so many ways in which this bill needs to be more ambitious. And the first is, which I'm sure will resonate with you, Jeff, is the independence of our Electoral Commission. The last government actually created a new power to set the Commission's strategy, which is a major incursion on its independence. It breaches at least 8 different international standards, and it saw the UK's ranking tank from 15th in the world to 49th in terms of the independence of its electoral bodies. We know that, the biggest threat to democracy and that authoritarians will go straight for an electoral commission. We know the FEC has been hobbled at the moment by, it can't even operate because of partisan gridlock and the fact that electoral commissions are not being replaced, right? So unless you have a really robust electoral commission, it doesn't matter what rules you have, frankly, because they're just not going to be enforced. So that's really, really crucial. The second is spending limits and donation caps. The government didn't go anywhere near this, but it's really important. We know that after the Musk donation, 60% of people thought there should be some kind of donation cap. And we need spending limits all year round, actually. It's no longer good enough just to have them in the run-up to elections because we know that campaigning is full-time and all year round. And then the final thing is new risks like crypto. What are we going to do about crypto donations? And actually, what are we going to do about the algorithms that push particular political messages towards audiences? So those are the areas we've got to fight on. All of you here and online, get ready to write to your MP and harass them and tell them that they've got to tighten this up because this really is an important opportunity.
Thank you very much, Sue. And yes, there is this huge opportunity with the elections bill. It would be a great shame if it got sort of watered down. I can geek out about the details of both the bill and the holes that there are beforehand. There are some grotesque holes, one of which is the fact that amounts under £500 are not legally speaking donations. And so if you give 10 of them, they don't add up to anything because none of them were donations. And there's a whole lot of other loopholes like that. Anyway, I'm now delighted that we're joined by Parth Patel. Parth is the Associate Director for Democracy and Politics, I think, at IPPR, and is a real expert at diagnosing the problems, both with our democratic system and with patients as well, as a trained doctor. So, Parth, do you want to just throw in some comments? I wasn't thinking about the medicine side, but more about the democracy side. So thank you for being with us. And if you can do an Irish accent as well for Peter, that would be even better.
I'll have to apologise for that. I'm sorry for not being Peter. He's far more intelligent and interesting than I am and has a much better voice. But I will do my best. I'm also sorry for being late. The trains failed me. And actually, I was caught up in Westminster having a conversation about how we can expand the constitutional imagination if we can. And frankly, it didn't go that well, that conversation, but we will keep pushing that argument because, in a way, I haven't really talked about this, but another way I think that's similar between, I think, America and Britain today are the new actors on the right and their vision to sort of roll the state back to this more medieval form based on patronage and personal relationships and someone with divine power ruling over a more hierarchical society. Those are forces that are starting to emerge in this country in a really spooky, scary way. Lots of people are following this in kind of terms of indefinite leave to remain and immigration and shifts in political equality or normalization of political inequality. One way to combat that is actually by trying to expand a new kind of constitutional conversation and getting people to talk in different ways. So that I'll say that, but not really come back to that for now. Okay, so it was really, really interesting to listen to both speakers before this, and maybe I'll just try and take a step back and think about the problem that's in front of us, and then come back to ways in which we can think about sort of dealing with it. So, in terms of is democracy for sale, one important way of thinking about this is why have democracies like Britain's or like America's largely allowed inequality, particularly sort of top-end inequality, sort of top 10%, 1% of people on the income distribution, wealth distribution. Why have we allowed that to rise and remain so high? That doesn't really make sense, from a democracy's perspective, if we're letting a small sliver of people at the top end, even the 1% or the 10%, sort of get away from the rest of us in democratic terms. And we know that's happening as a result of deliberate policy choices, right? We're sort of unshackling how market forces organize our societies, and we're making deliberate and specific changes to the tax and transfer system that allows inequality, sort of permits it to be higher than it had been sort of 30, 40, 50 years ago. So it's essentially a pro-affluent, intentional realignment of economic and social policy. And the reason I say it doesn't make sense, because, well, if everyone was politically equal, well, surely we wouldn't want that, you know? It's sort of 90% of us are going to be worse off because we're allowing a segment to run away. Well, realistically, we're not going to tolerate that, right? Except we do tolerate it. So what's going on there? Why is that? Why are we permitting that? Maybe we don't mind. Our interests aren't the same as our attitudes. We think inequality is fine, it's fair, it's merited, you know what, they worked hard for it, it's okay. But that's a reasonable hypothesis, but when you look, sort of peel back the curve, the sort of the cover on public attitudes, that's just not the case. 8 in 10 people in Britain think income inequality is too high. 7 in 10 think government should more proactively enact policies to redistribute it. So, and that group of people, the 7 in 10, the 8 in 10, they're sort of overrepresented in the middle and bottom third of earners. So this is not an attitudinal thing. People want the country to be more equal or less unequal, and it's in their own interests. And yet we don't have it. So we have to reckon with a second hypothesis that maybe we're not all politically equal. Maybe some people just have more power and more sway over the collective decision-making endeavor that is democracy. The well-heeled are more likely to get their way than the worse off. And you can see that sounds slightly populist, and the reason it kind of sticks is because it's kind of true. And so, okay, fine, let's reckon with that. There are systematic differences in who gets their way in British democracy, in American democracy, frankly, in most democracies. And that's not a random error. So, of course, not everyone's always going to get their way in democracy, right? We have different views. Sometimes I win, sometimes I lose. Maybe next time it's my time. Sort of, we expect sometimes people can get their way, other times they're not. And that would be fine. It was a bunch of random kind of occurrences of who's getting their way. But we see systematic patterns across virtually every country that we can describe as a democracy, where the well-heeled are more likely to get their way with policy choices than the worse off. So why is that happening? I think about this in basically 2 ways. There's 2 ways why this could happen. One, there are like patterns, systematic differences in who's speaking, who's voting, who's expressing their preferences, right? So people who are richer, have been to university, are more likely to turn up to the ballot box, that type of thing. That's one phenomenon. I'm not going to talk about that. There's a second phenomenon going on, though, which is it's not just about differences in who's voting and expressing their preferences. It's a difference. There are systematic differences in how those votes and preferences turn into government and policy. Right, so something about that mechanism that connects a vote and an expression, a freedom of expression, into government, parliamentarians, and policy. There's something in that process that's clearly tilting it one way. Right, there's a few things there, but I'm going to focus specifically on what we've been asked to speak about, which is how money has a particular warping effect on collective decision-making, or you can say capital if you kind of prefer those terms. What I'm alluding to there is there's a long history of literature that precedes the 3 of us on this panel, and people who think about how money affects democracy. So, okay, what's going on? How does money kind of warp and tilt decision-making in Britain and maybe actually in other places? Maybe I'll try and set out what I see as kind of a few pathways or theories. I think there are 3 ways it does that. I think money helps select who becomes a politician, a legislator, a decision maker. So you put your money behind a horse, they may be more likely to win, right? That's slightly, quite a lot of what Sue was talking about was kind of falling in that bucket. Political campaigning, you fund parties, you fund individuals, then they're more likely to win. There's a second way, which is like, okay, well, maybe it helps certain people get selected, and those certain people or those certain parties are more likely to represent your interests or your ideologies or your worldviews and therefore kind of act on your behalf. That's one thing. But there's also a process after that that has nothing to do with elections. Like, okay, given the elections happened, money still has a role. It still affects and sways decision makers, right? This is lobbying, for example, or kind of threatening certain people that if you don't do this, I'll pull out my investment on that. So there's that second ballpark of ways in which kind of money affects how decisions are made in democracy. And then there's a third way, and I have to say this because if Peter was here, he would definitely say this is the most important way, which is money and capital does sort of buy up and is increasingly buying up sort of parts of our information and ideas infrastructure. And this is something that Peter is particularly really sharp at and really interesting at, and sort of thinking about the new public sphere and social media companies owned by certain people or think tanks owned by certain people, and how that actually matters in affecting what we discuss and deliberate in a democracy, what's possible, what's not possible, and how we should think a lot more about that. Maybe I'll say something very brief on those three things and then wrap up. I'm not keeping track of time, so forgive me. So that first one I talked about, how money and wealth can help select decision makers. So in Britain, I think Sue referred to a lot of this, so I might gloss over it, but there's a few things happening. First of all, the volume of money in British politics has gone up. Private donations doubled in the UK since the turn of the century, since 2000, and sort of £3-5 million donations are actually becoming increasingly normal. Those were totally unheard of 2 or 3 years ago, and actually now we sort of don't really bat as much of an eyelid when we see that, and there's something going on there. So we've got a bigger volume of money in British politics, and that volume is more concentrated. Sue had a much better statistic than this, which will be a more recent one, but sort of the top 10% of all donors to British political parties, that's the Labour Party, that's the Tory Party, that's the Reform Party, and that's the Lib Dems, account for more than 50% of those parties' total amounts of money. So even parties that we might call progressive, the Labour Party and the Lib Dem, have very concentrated funders. And we've seen a rise of super donors, people that are giving over £100,000 a year to political parties, accounting for a total share of British political donations. So you've got more money, and that money is more concentrated. And worryingly, even though you've got more money sloshing around, so you think, it's probably going less far, because there's so much more money, its effects are diluted. We're not seeing that. We're actually seeing the opposite. The relationship between how much you spend and whether or not you're likely to win an election has increased. It's strengthened at the local level, at individual constituency level, elections for members of parliament, so for parliamentary elections at the national level. That relationship has strengthened. And that's from a series of work from academics at Nuffield College, Oxford. So the three of those things in tandem, they're pretty spooky, huh? Like, we've got more money, it's more concentrated, and it has more of an impact than it's traditionally had. The optimism is that people kind of know this is happening, and this was the case with the American public attitudes too. And you've seen a real kind of awareness here in the public and how public attitudes have changed over the past 12, 14 years. I think it's 2011, sort of about 40% of people kind of thought, yeah, there's a decent amount of transparency in this, and yeah, donors matter, but they're not too worrying. That's totally collapsed. There's sort of 10, 11% of people now believe that. And when you ask people who has the most influence on politicians, and you sort of give them the option of donors, business, media, voters themselves, trade unions, you list out all the classic groups, donors come out on top, like time and time again now. And so there's something that's clearly shifted, and the public imaginary is kind of like, well, money is sloshing around politics and it feels corrupt. And that's an interesting aspect of politics today. Most people actually perceive there to be a degree of corruption. And that's a niche in the market, really, because no one is trying to mobilize and campaign on that issue, at least not in Britain. The Labour Party is obviously doing some things there, but it's not quite grasped that as like this is a central message of what the party is going to be about. So that's selecting decision makers, swaying decision makers. I can see Julian's telling me to hurry up, so I won't say much apart from lobbying, it matters, and Sue knows a lot about this, so you should just talk to her, really. But there's also direct employment. Britain is, compared to every OECD country, we have way more MPs and peers on the boards of publicly listed companies. I think 10 years ago, something about 50% of the FTSE 500 had, I think it was the FTSE 100, had a peer or an MP associated with it. So that's quite high. That's quite a lot of people. They're not always in direct employment, but they're certainly on a board. And then we obviously have people who are directly employed. And 1 in 5 MPs today have a second job. And the last thing that I said, which is Peter's sort of real sort of passion, is about this ideas and information infrastructure. The architects of our new media ecosystem, people who own X, people who own Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp. Those are only 2 people. We've got GB News, which has been created, and you can kind of see okay, well, who's funded GB News? How come he also funds these 3 think tanks? What do these 3 think tanks say? Interesting. They say the same thing that Nick Timothy says, which weirdly Robert Jendrick is starting to say. And you can connect the dots there really quickly, which Peter does. Actually, I'll end with that as a salute to Peter in his LRB article about Paul Marshall, which I encourage everyone to go read.
Thank you very much, Parth.
You talked about it being spooky, which I assume is appropriate for tomorrow, and we have the ghost of Peter somewhere up here. So we're going to come to questions in a couple of minutes, but there's just a couple of things I'd just like to quickly pick up. We may come back to the elections bill, but can we just pick up on the US? So Jeff, as you know, there's been a National Popular Vote Interstate Compact to deal with the disaster of the Electoral College system and all the problems that causes. That's been running for 20 years. It's been stuck at 3/4 of the support in the states necessary for it to come in, and it doesn't even need Congress to support it. You've got some pretty impressive numbers towards getting where you need to get to. Is there a risk it will just stall the same way that stalled?
No, I don't think so. I think and I won't comment on your characterization of our beloved electoral college system for electing our president. To be fair, it does, do I need a mic or is this okay? Okay. To be fair, it does reflect the system in America, which constitutionally in the beginning was intended to actually be part of an anti-corruption scheme, which is federalism, distributing power. And so you have 50 states, they all have legislatures, states have actually general powers. The federal government was supposed to have limited powers. There was concern about, a king, and you wanted the president to actually be elected by the same kind of allocation of power that spread it around, so that the notion that, sure, Maine, as I mentioned, with fewer than 1 million voters, has 2 senators, and so does Texas or California, which has, I don't even know, 30, 40 million. That doesn't sound fair. The Electoral College doesn't always reflect the popular vote because by design. So you can say that's good or it's bad. A lot of people say it's bad now. So there is this idea of national popular vote that somehow if the states just all agreed to deliver their votes in the way that the national popular vote went, rather than the Electoral College's allocation of votes to each state based on the system, that would be better. I think the reason it stalled, though, is it ran into, it wasn't a constitutional amendment. So there actually, I think it was too clever by half, frankly. Because constitutional amendments are hard, there was this idea, well, the states will just agree, and then we won't need to amend the Constitution to change this scheme. And it did get ahead of wind, but then came a number of things, including January 6, 2020, when it became clear, at least to me, that we could not count on the states, when push came to shove, to actually voluntarily deliver their Electoral College votes to a candidate that their state did not support. And I think it would unravel probably quickly if put to the test. And I think one of the lessons learned, which we have certainly tried to share and apply, is that we have deep-seated constitutional issues. That's one. The amendment that we're working on around money in politics is a constitutional issue for the reasons I've said. There are others, like term limits that people talk about, or as our national debt reaches, $38 trillion, people are talking about a fiscal responsibility amendment. So I think I have heard one of your other former prime ministers, who I did not meet on a plane, Winston Churchill, said that Americans always do the right thing after exhausting all the other possibilities. And the right thing is taking constitutional issues seriously enough to bring it to the people around a constitutional amendment. And when you do that at the right time, with the right answer and a constitutional consensus, you get very different results. And so, I think our amendment, which we're showing, let me just give you Utah, a very conservative state, was the most recent vote on our amendment. And this was this year, it's the 23rd state. The vote in this state was 20-4 in the Senate and 63-9 in the House. So it's not even close. That's the kind of consensus that makes amendments actually happen. My friend, Congressman Jamie Raskin, who's also a constitutional lawyer and somewhat of a historian, says constitutional amendments always move from impossible to inevitable. Their systems shifts and they have tipping points. And I think that's the big difference. And so why I'm confident is that all the pieces are in place for this kind of a tipping point, and I think the Utah vote is an example, that this will look very much like other amendments. And I'll just close with this final comment on amendments and why the tipping point kind of notion is apt, whereas slogging through statutorily with the Electoral College reform without confronting the constitutional issue perhaps wasn't the right strategy or wouldn't work now. And if you look at the women's right to vote, that sounds obvious to us now, but it was hard fought for decades and decades. Women suffragists and many men suffragists trying to get that vote in 1915 had votes in 4 different states, including my own of Massachusetts. They lost all 4 in 1915. They lost votes easily in Congress in 16 and 17. In 1918, it passed by 2/3. It was ratified within 18 to 24 months, and the amendment was done. And so that's how quickly it goes if you actually take on the conversation, bring it to the American people, and bring it forward at a time when it's recognized that this is a binary choice. One path is very bad, the other path is much better. People will take the better path, and I think that's the big difference.
Just very quickly before I come on to 2 colleagues here, we'd love to invite you for the celebratory party when it passes.
Oh.
When should I book the slot?
I'm sorry, the last
When should I book the slot for the party?
You can book it anytime in 2029. Yeah.
Fantastic. So,
preferably towards the latter part of the year.
okay, so late 2029, if you'd all like to come back, we'll have that celebration. And I'd love to know your thoughts. We've talked a lot about the UK system, the electoral bill. We've caught some of the plague that's coming in, financial plague from the US. Are there lessons that we should be learning about the treatments or offers that you would like to make that Jeff and his team should be picking up from our situation? Sue, Parth?
I mean, I think one thing that I think is really inspiring about what you're doing, Jeff, is really engaging people about this. So it is a kind of, the democratic legitimacy will be there. And I think, one of the things we had more hope for when this government came to power is that they would take things like citizens' assemblies and citizens' juries more seriously as a kind of participatory tool. And Gordon Brown did a whole report on this. And so, at the moment, we're just stuck with polls, which are a very kind of blunt measure, right? But I think, how do we get a decent conversation which isn't just a kind of black and white, do you think this or not, but actually brings the public with us on how we tackle some of these issues. So I guess that's a learning for us, I think, actually, from you. I'll think about whether we've got any learnings for you.
We'll take any advice.
Yeah, in a way, we could actually just work on this right now. I don't know if this mic's working or not, but I can just speak out. Because the elections bill has not been brought to Parliament, and one of the risks is that it doesn't get brought to Parliament, and when it does, it's done sort of so quietly. Let's just like sneak it through in a watered down form. And one way to try and combat that is to run a public campaign, and trying to animate people around why this matters, and therefore build a kind of a consensus that shifts it from impossible to inevitable. So I kind of agree with that, and I'm almost jealous of the sort of Republican tradition in America, and sort of the fact that you do have a constitution and you do care about political equality and you do want an active and engaged citizenry. Even though those don't feel very true right now, you have ideals that you work to that we constantly, every time we bring that conversation up in Britain, people are like, well, we didn't have a revolution, did we? And you sort of run out of road quite quickly. So, I mean, to the question about elections bill, where are we at on that? I think I probably agree with where Sue is at, and we've both been involved in trying to get the government to commit to it. And I think there's lots of aspects to it that are good. There's lots of specific things there that feel like no-brainers. But I would say, like, overall, it's not a very demanding set of reforms. And the one big thing that I know people like Duncan definitely agree with is putting a cap on political donations, just putting a flat cap on. Actually, no one should be allowed to give above X amount of money in a year. And that is not a battle that we've won. That is not a feature of the elections bill. And that is easily the most powerful thing we could do, because it talks about money and the influence of money on British politics rather than the influence of foreigners on British politics. And obviously the second of those is important. Of course, we want a degree of sovereignty over what happens in British politics. We don't want foreign interference, but that seems to be the only goal, really, of the reforms. And they're as much less interested in, well, if you're just a really rich British guy that wants tax cuts for the rich British people, yeah, we'll still let you lobby us. And I think that's the problem.
So, I'd now like to bring in questions from other people other than me. I have quite strong opinions on much of this, and I should admit I'm a director of an organisation called the Joseph Rowntree Reform Trust, and we have funded various people in this room to do campaigning on this. There's a certain incestuous thing here. But it would be lovely to hear questions from other people. Can I start with the one right in the middle there, and then I'll come to the other person there, and then...
Thank you. Thanks for the contributions. Fascinating discussion. It talks a lot about the origin of some of the money, the dark money, etc., and transparency around that, and the amounts are huge. But I wonder how is it being spent? And have you noticed any recent kind of trends or patterns in regards to AI, or how's money dumped in elections versus gobbled up by the party machine? So yeah, how's it being spent generally, and anything new coming through there?
Thank you. That's a great question, because how it's been spent is a big part of the problem. The Supreme Court's rationale for saying this is a free speech right that we can't limit is this notion of independent spending. So technically it is still the law in America that if you want to contribute to a congressional campaign itself, there's a limit. I can't remember what it is exactly. It goes up for inflation, but it's about $3,000, okay? That's still the law. But if you put the money into a super PAC, an independent expenditure vehicle, as it's called, there is no limit, because the Supreme Court's theory is that that doesn't corrupt. So a lot of the money now goes into the super PACs, and they act just like the campaigns, except this. They are far less accountable because they're not tied. You can't see the candidate's name. It's a name that sounds good or whatever. And so they are almost exclusively used, and the money is used to drive fear, anger, rage, division, and hatred to motivate their voters to stop the evil on the other side. And both parties have their super PACs, and so most of the money is going into media, social media, operative campaigns that are about inflaming divisions in America. And when I say there's I heard the number you have of, I think you said, Sue, about the Russian spending to influence British politics. We have the same, of course, with the threat of foreign intelligence operations trying to exploit divisions to undermine our society. It is very hard to tell the difference between the domestic super PAC spending that is inflaming divisions and the KGB's version. They do the same thing. And so I think that's what is so dangerous. This is money that isn't being used to just, the notion that it was free speech, the theory was, well, we'll get more ideas, there'll be more amplification of messages, so the voters will have more information and be able to make decisions. Instead, most of the money is inundating people with the things that tear society apart and drive the divisions and hatreds and the collapse of civic trust that was mentioned. So that's, and that's, you can look at the data on the percentage of the money that's spent on the negative attacks versus the promotion of a candidate, and it's like 99 to 1%. It's not even, almost all the super PAC money is negative attacks.
Yeah, Sue.
We actually now have our first Great British PAC. Don't know if you know about that. You probably don't want to know about it. I didn't want to know about it either. But and I think what's really interesting about that, and for some reason it hasn't been registered yet with the Electoral Commission as a campaigner, is that it's very cleverly promoting issues that are generally very attractive to far-right parties. So like flags, for instance, was like a really big campaign of theirs. But I feel that actually there's some very clever electoral advice being given to some of the campaigners and about how you fund the ecosystem. You know, obviously the parties want it for their ground war. They need people to do the door knocking, you know, but actually it's in that kind of space, as Parth's been talking about, that kind of information ecosystem, that, you know, that's where we have far less transparency, and which is why we need these annual spending limits with annual transparency about what's being spent on digital campaigning, and, you know, so we have a clearer picture of actually what is being spent to influence us.
Parth, do you want to? No. So, and then there's a question at the back. I can see a few other coming up. I'll do my best to fit people in. Yes.
Okay. So I am a dual citizen. I am a British citizen and I'm an American citizen. And so I have two questions here. First, on the American front, you've mentioned several times issues that have come through the Supreme Court, and you talked about constitutional amendments happening a bit in clusters. Are you pursuing anything that is an amendment that addresses ethical standards for the Supreme Court and issues where money has been targeted specifically at the Supreme Court and is potentially creating part of our problems? That is question number one. Question number two on the British side is, you mentioned a penalty, a financial penalty, if someone is accepting donations over a certain amount. And the problem that jumps into my mind, and maybe you have addressed this and I'm just not understanding it, is that if you have a financial penalty for accepting larger donations, what's to stop them from taking in those donations and just paying the penalty? Is there a greater consequence? So.
There's a lot of questions, and if you're online, please do put some in as well. So if I can encourage people to have short questions and short answers.
My short answer is no. And that's because strategically it's hard enough to do one amendment. So if anybody wants to do that amendment, you know, I think we're in an amendment era, and we probably will have 3 or 4 amendments before we're done with it in the next decade or two. So, but no, part of our success and the reason we can hold Americans together, no matter the divisions from, you know, we are at American Promise Republicans, Democrats, and Independents, is because we do one thing, it's clear, we don't have mission creep, we are getting this amendment to the Constitution that actually, it does address a problem with the court, which is they've usurped the authority to decide what's okay about limiting money in politics and what's not. That belongs to the people in the elected branches. This amendment fixes that, and so that's what we're focused on.
Very quick one. 20K parking fine territory, absolutely. You know, just to be clear, actually there is no penalty for taking donations above a limit. You know, that you can accept donations however much you want, but it would be more for like not declaring your donations properly or spending over the limit and not declaring it. So there are lots of breaches in that line. But so, you know, that question was put to the Electoral Commission. Isn't it 500k if you've given a like £5 million donation? Is 500k really enough? You know, I mean, I think most of us think not really. And they said they would also, you'd have to pay back the donation as well. So they're thinking that is enough, but, you know, I think there are questions about whether we need something stronger.
Yeah, and a good place to look for that is like France or Germany, and the amount that the electoral regulators over there can fine. I can't remember exactly how much it was, but there was questions about some dodgy donations going to the AfD, and the amount that the fine was insane, actually. So I think there's precedent for doing more. I was going to say something very briefly on the constitutional thing, which is, in a way, constitutional change is so difficult. It will probably things will probably have to get worse before they can get better. I know you were slightly alluding to this, but in addition to the Jill Lepore book you mentioned, the best book I've read on this is by Linda Colley, an Anglo-American, called The Gun, the Ship and the Pen, and it links the questions of sort of the making of the modern world and constitution writing. Not really this kind of utopian dream about nation building, but more of something that's done in the face of threat and warfare.
So I'm going to take, I think there are 3 questions I've seen on this side. It's going up, but I'll start with the 3 I saw, if that's all right, and then if I can get you to answer those 3. So yes, we'll start with you.
Thank you. Kimberly Ellis. I am a member of the Better Futures program from California. I've spent the better part of the last 20 years recruiting and training Democratic women to run for office through an organization called Emerge, which was inspired by Kamala Harris when she first ran for DA. I want to piggyback off of what this woman said in terms of sort of clusters for amendments. Specifically, really interested in why there hasn't been focus on passing the Equal Rights Amendment, which would have given women equality across the board. That had the number of states required, that had the number of Congress members required, and when it got time to certify it, they sort of said, "Oh, that time frame has passed, so we're not gonna pass it." So, would strongly encourage to perhaps look at a strategy where you're doing clusters, including ones that center on equity, especially around women. And as it relates to women, when it comes to kind of, trying to pass some of these reform things, electing more women and getting more women elected has been shown through research that they are pro supporting things like getting money out of politics. I want to put in.
Can you pass the microphone on here?
Thank you. From this side of the Atlantic, some years ago, one thing that was striking about American politics was the monitoring, counting, and boasting about the number of small donors political candidates were able to marshal behind them as a sign of their democratic potency, their political virility. So that's the other side of the coin. As these billionaires have bought up our politics, the ordinary citizens have walked away from political parties and campaigns. What do you think it would take to get back to a situation where that was seen as a political strength, the number of different people that were supporting your campaign?
And then the final question this set, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, first of all, for fascinating contributions. None of you really talked about the media. If I'm a billionaire and you stop me buying a political party, why don't I just buy a newspaper or a television channel or whatever it may be nowadays?
Okay, so we have roughly ERA, small donors, and problems with the media. Who wants to solve all three of those problems first? Jeff!
I won't solve them, but I will say something, which is, I was inspired by my mother's work on the ERA back in the 70s. I remember it well as a kid, and so, it was probably the fifth amendment of those four amendments in that last amendment era, and I think part of the problem it ran into was that era had passed, and we talked to Gloria Steinem, actually, a leader of that effort before we launched American Promise, about what lessons learned, and one of the things she told us was to go to the states that she felt that the ERA came out of Congress too quickly before they were ready in enough states, and that's why it was not ratified within a 7 years deadline. That deadline was extended another 7 years, and then some states started rescinding, so they just got very bollocksed up, to use a British phrase. But you're from California, so I don't have to say that. And the recent energy around the ERA, getting it actually certified as ratified, I think is part of the new amendment era again. Like, people are talking about constitutional amendments, including the ERA. So yes, but not us, because we're going to do one amendment until we get it passed and ratified. Clusters don't have to be one organization. In fact, I think it's very important that they're not, because they are all influencing each other, I think, these different pushes, but no one group should be doing everything. This is what we will do. But it's out there, just as you put it into this room. It's out there for sure. And then small donors, 15%, 16% in 2024. So the notion that small dollar donors are somehow going to balance it all out, or that fundraising and money in politics is a democratic thing because there's lots of small dollars, it's not true. It's a small percentage of the money in American politics. And I think it's going to, how we get back there is an amendment to the Constitution, because there's a collapse in trust and faith. Like, what does your money matter? Like, why, $1 million doesn't get your phone calls returned anymore. Imagine putting $100 in when there's inflation and all kinds of other things. What difference will it make? That kind of feeling. So I think part of the renewal that we need is a rebuilding of civic trust, and that what you do and say and participate, including by making donations, actually matters. And And that won't matter until we get, the 85% of the money, which is coming from very, very large donors, scaled back down, in my view. Question number 3, I did have an answer for, if you remind me.
About the media ownership.
The media, yeah. So it's that concentration of power. I think it touches on the equality issue, and I think political equality is actually a word in the amendment. I'll have napkins for everybody if you afterwards, but we are putting political equality back into this analysis of how you think about money in politics, because the Supreme Court pulled it out. And part of that is the concentration of power in the media as well. But that's not a new problem. And I think if we do the things that we are talking about tonight, if we do this amendment and much more, we're dealing with new technologies and new concentrations of power. But fundamentally, it's the same as the media barons in the early 1900s. It's the same when we got radio and we had to decide, how many radio stations could one person own in a town, well, we in a city. We had limits on that. TV, every new technology brings new challenges, and every era of concentrated wealth trying to be leveraged into political wealth gets a response. And I think how we respond will address that media question as well. And we don't have to assume that the way it is now is the way it will be. But until we get the political power back with the people to be able to have a reasonable conversation about checking and balancing concentrated media power, it's going to be difficult. So that's why we look at the political equality as the high leverage move.
Parth and Sue, and I will try to fit in the last set of questions. There's a lot of them, so.
Should I go first? Okay, cool. I'll try and be brief. So I really, really, really think actually probably the most important way to get more political equality is to think about the social and economic backgrounds of who becomes a politician. There's emerging consensus of that in the academy, and it is guaranteed the most unpopular topic I work on when I talk to politicians. They don't like the fact that I'm sort of pointing to the fact they come from a particular strata of society, and maybe that's not a great way for democracy to function. So women, yes, but also people from other backgrounds. I think we do need to think quite hard about that, because that's an important filtering mechanism about how votes turn into policy. Duncan's question about small donations, I put the fault at how the political party as an institution itself has changed. It's all political parties, virtually everywhere, apart from some really new ones, have withdrawn from civil society writ large. They're no longer interested in mass memberships or members being useful parts of their political party. They're no longer interested in that concept of the mass, actually, and that applies to donors too. So, okay, let's just take 1 or 2 or 3 people. Let's professionalize. We have an operation. We just need a set amount of money. It's so much easier if it's 2 people who give us money rather than hundreds of people, because then we have to listen to hundreds of people and bring them along with us. Yeah. And that's the whole bloody fucking point of democracy. Media, yes. So I agree there are similarities. Press barons, Rupert Murdoch. This new stuff has got some similarities. It's also different because, first of all, these are different technologies. They're not just kind of places where we get information. They're also places where we communicate with each other. And then form and the nature is really different. It's not words, it's images and videos. And it's making us all much more judgmental, much more reactive, right? I basically go on my phone and I look at a picture of someone on holiday or someone's new baby or someone's dog, and I just automatically type like. And I'm reacting to them, and there's something fundamental about the way human conversation is changing that these guys are in control of. There's something problematic about that, and the other thing that's fundamentally different is algorithms. It's not editors. So if I'm Rupert Murdoch and I call someone up saying you need to run this story, the editor usually is going to push back on Murdoch saying, no, I'm not going to do that. Algorithms don't do that. You tell a coder to code something, and look at what's happened to X. It just happens, right? The amount of stuff we see on X that's just basically like pseudo-fascist is bizarre. And that's quite a lot of power. That's a new form of power we haven't really properly theorized yet.
Sue, and then I'm going to try and take a last set of 3 questions and 1 from online.
I'm happy to...
Fine.
Yeah,
So in that case, we take the 3 questions there and then the 2 at the front.
So all the problems you listed were all financial. Fair enough, that was the title of the evening. But I was a little bit surprised at all the solutions you offered for financial. So do you have any other solutions? And I'll give you a starter for 10. I'm on the county council. We just passed a policy motion where we're going to be working with schools about how they educate children on their democratic rights and participatory rights. So, yeah, other solutions.
Okay. And the 2 at the front.
Yeah, so my question is around your 2/3 vote in Congress to get the amendment passed. I mean, currently our Congress is not functioning particularly well and is doing as bidded by our president. I'm just curious what your optimism is and confidence that that will actually occur.
So it's just coincidence we have a question about school children and Congress, one after the other. and the last question in the room, yes.
I know the title is Democracy for Sale, but my question is it already sold? And if you're thinking about 2029, well, 2028 is coming up, and that's going to be a very, very critical moment in American history. I think, and I'd like to get your, because of course you have to work for these things, but there's in parallel other things happening that might beat you to, democracy.
So we have, democracy education, is Congress functioning, and what else is coming down the track? Can I encourage fairly brief responses?
Oh, no, go for it, and then I'll...
Okay. Well, just a brief response on the other solutions is, the amendment is one of the biggest civic exercises Americans ever do, and there's a massive amount of education and civic renewal. And so I'd like to think of it as what it achieves is, is important, but so too is what it necessitates for achieving it is a very massive citizen empowerment exercise. But there's lots of other solutions out there that are not in our wheelhouse, but so I'll leave those to others. So Congress and timing. So this is typical. We are building the support in the states. Congress will be the last to know. But I'll say two things on that. One is 2/3 votes in Congress, even as dysfunctional as it is, are actually a lot more common than conventional wisdom or than any of us tend to think. And I've started keeping track of them, of course, because it's of great interest to us. And there's a great many number of very large bipartisan votes on lots of different things. That doesn't mean this will be easy. And so the Democrats have gotten the head start. They have an excellent version of the amendment that's very close to what we're talking with the Republicans about. And almost every Democrat in the House and Senate is already a co-sponsor of that. So that gets us to about halfway there. The tip happens when the Republicans introduce their own version of it rather than, it won't be kumbaya, work together at first. So there does need to be a little bit of time, and I'll just combine the questions, for this to play out, both in the states and in Congress. But the Republican Party today is actually much more conducive to getting this done than 5 or 10 years ago. The populist right is actually incredibly supportive of this. It fits exactly with their analysis that elites have taken over, and we need to return power to the people. Senator Josh Hawley, as some of you may know, very conservative senator. He was a constitutional lawyer before he was in the Senate. Says Citizens United is not originalism, the conservative theory of how the Constitution should be interpreted. He says it needs to go. He wants to end this practice. We are having really interesting conversations with Republicans now. We do reflect every American political faction at American Promise. So we do go to CPAC and ALEC and Federalist Society, and just as we go to the liberal ones. And I can tell you the support there is just as strong, but it will take some time because this is a somewhat new approach for conservatives to take. Mitch McConnell, the previous sort of Republican Party leader, was much less likely to support this. So that's where the optimism comes from. The strategy is working, the support is there. We just need the time to let it be expressed and bring it together for the vote.
Thank you. Sue and then Parth.
I'm glad Josh Hawley's doing something decent, because I have had American friends say, is he a relative of yours? No, I have no influence. On the other civic, other solutions, civic education, I'm really glad you're mentioning that, because I've got a 17-year-old who's like, why are they giving 16-year-olds the vote? My friends are really ignorant. It's really a disaster. And I think, I'm like, well, it will only work, if there is civic education. And I'm pleased to say, now he's doing his politics A-level, he's actually learning about political donations. And you kind of think that would be really good if people learned actually more clearly about how the system worked. And but I think there are also some other really big issues, like we haven't really addressed, like PR, you know, like as having 2 kids who are just voting for the first time and you having to say, no, you can't vote for what you believe, by the way. You know, you've got to vote for this party if you want to get that. It's, you know, it's death to democratic participation, right? And I think, you know, we know that the obviously the last attempt at it failed, but like there is a growing swell of Labour backbenchers who want a national commission to look at that. And I think that, just to say on the elections bill, I think we know we're not going to get as much as we want, and we have to see it as part of a bigger, this is an electoral strategy, and there must be something beyond this bill that we fight for, which includes things like, you know, PR, whole-scale reform of how parties are funded. And but also, at the end of the day, something you said, Parth, is actually they need decent policies, you know, that attract people, which comes back to the small donations. I mean, I thought that Mamdani in New York is really touting the fact that he is, you know, all based on small donations. And you can only rely on small donations if you are actually having policies that fit with your voter base instead of chasing the votes of other parties through focus groups.
Thank you. And Parth.
Yeah, I'll fuse the third and the first question because I think they're getting at the same thing. So democracy, is it already sold? I would say no, actually. I don't think you can really sell or buy democracy. I think democracy is a set of ideals, it's a set of beliefs, and sometimes we're closer to those ideals and sometimes we're further away. So there's ideals of political equality, constitutions that prevent the abuse of power, that pursue the common good, that ensure the citizens are active and engaged. You know, we just have to try always to get closer to these ideals, and right now it looks like we're moving further away, but we can move back closer, and that's the beauty of democracy. There is uncertainty in it, and there's agency in it, and you have to have some faith in your capacity to shape what lies ahead, and that's the whole point of democracy. The future is susceptible to our influence. The point about what about things beyond money, and I kind of take your point about it educating young people and Sue's point, and kind of think actually we need to think even bigger than that. We've got to think way bigger than that. So look, like the distinguishing mood of the time is a yearning for control and decisive political action. And populists and the new right speak directly to this. You know, they've got a plan to concentrate power in the executive, bypass parliament, dismantle the administrative state, undermine the judiciary.
Get rid of the BBC.
Get rid of the BBC. You know, the list goes on. It's huge. They're thinking at a scale that the progressives, liberals, the left don't think on anymore. They are thinking on that level. And I think that the challenge for people like us is to be able to come up with an audacious and daring program of our own that can go toe-to-toe with that feels as bold and as daring as that, but deepens democratic convictions, deepens liberal convictions. And we're not good at coming up with some of those ideas. We've got a few of them. I think some of them are starting to come out and to come through, but we need to think harder.
Thank you. One question from online, and I'll give you each a sentence, starting with Parth and going that way, to answer this question. One sentence only. Which country has the gold standard for a democratic society and why? Parth.
Does Taiwan count as a country?
Taiwan, yeah, well, discuss. Sue.
I think Ireland's doing pretty well.
Ireland?
I need more sentences to justify this, but I will stand with America the Beautiful.
Very patriotic. We could have continued for a long time. There are more questions here. I know there are more questions in the room. But thank you, Jeff, particularly for coming from the US for this. And thank you very much, Sue and Parth, for coming from elsewhere in the UK to be here for this. And we have a lot more here at the IF. Next week, we're talking about the role of fiction in protests and fighting against authoritarianism. There is much, much more. In 2029, we're having Jeff back for the celebration party. But that's it for tonight. Thank you very much, all three of you, for being with us.